Okay. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started now. My name is Megan Bobrowski. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Student Life, which is the newspaper here on campus. And we are hosting Marianne Williamson tonight with the Pomona College Politics Department. So first of all, I just wanted to thank you all for being here. But before we get started, there's a few guidelines that I wanted to go over. First, I want to make sure everyone knows where the 3 exits are. So there's an exit right here, and then there's the 2 exits in the back in case of an emergency. Please silence your cell phones and refrain from taking any flash photography during the event. As you know, we have a special guest here tonight, presidential candidate and former Pomona College student, Marianne Williamson. Woo! Okay. Ms. Williamson is a best-selling author, lecturer, and nonprofit activist. She's written 13 books, 4 of which reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. She's also founded 2 nonprofits, Project Angel Food, which has delivered more than 12 million meals to homebound aid patients, and the Peace Alliance, which supports the creation of a U.S. Department of Peace. For 35 years, she's been helping solve poverty, hunger, and racial reconciliation issues. And now she's running for President of the United States. Woo. Okay. Tonight's event will begin with a speech from Ms. Williamson, followed by a student-moderated discussion. Mark Rod, a senior at Pomona College and managing editor for The Student Life, and Hershey Surrey, a Pomona junior and student liaison for the politics department, will lead the discussion. Please hold all your questions to the end, as there will be a time for audience Q&A. Following the event, there will be a meet and greet with Ms. Williamson. If you're interested in that, please line up in front of the stage after the event ends. Thank you again for coming, and please join me in welcoming Marianne Williamson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, some of you probably know I was in the class of 1974 at Pomona. I was, but in my junior year, I left, and I told my parents I would be back in a couple of months, and it's taken 49 years. But so it's very poignant for me to be here and to look out at all of you. And I will tell you one story. What's the big theater, the big old theater? Okay. And there's a big green space in front of it, and there are these. So at that time, I know this sounds kind of silly, because it is, but in those days, the white girl with the black professor was really kind of a unique thing. And I was walking with a professor of mine who had a tremendous effect on my life, Stanley Crouch, many of you might know. He's this brilliant jazz critic, et cetera, and he was a teacher here at the time. And we were going to hear someone speak, and it's a moment I won't forget, because there was this absolutely stunningly gorgeous young woman. She was older than me, and she had on tight jeans, and she had on a work shirt. We called it a work shirt. And I just remember how gorgeous she was. And she looked over at us, and I just saw such light pouring out of her as she beamed this smile. It was Jane Fonda. And that was here at Pomona. I'll never forget it. Okay. Enough with that. As you know, I'm running for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States. Thank you. Thank you. We need a fundamental pattern disruption of the economic, social, and political dynamics that prevail within our country. This is a lot more than incremental change. This is a lot more than tweaking things here, tweaking things there. It entails a lot more than just defeating Donald Trump at the ballot box next year. I think of the president as an opportunistic infection. He couldn't have gotten hold of us. His agenda could not have gotten hold of us had there not been a weakened societal immune system. And each and every one of us should think of ourselves in a way as immune cells in our body politic. And if all we are to do is to elect a new president next year, that will mean that we didn't go over the cliff this time, but we need to do more than not go over the cliff. We need to get out of the vicinity of the cliff entirely. And if all we do is to defeat this one particular president, then the same forces that we should be most concerned about will just be back in the midterms in 2022, they'll be back in full force in 2024, et cetera. We have a bigger job in front of us. We think we have a big job defeating this president next year, and that's going to be a big job, but we have an even bigger job than that. We have a big ship that we need to turn around. We need a season of fundamental repair in this country. And I want to talk to you tonight about what that repair is. I want to talk to you about how we got here, and I want to talk to you also about what my ideas are for the kind of political agenda which will make the change come about. Now, I know that it's hard for you to believe, perhaps, being the age that you are, but I can tell you as an older woman that it wasn't always like this. Now, I'm not trying to whitewash or romanticize American capitalism or American society before the 1980s, but I can tell you there was, while not a society which always got things right, which always treated people right, there was a social consensus that we were at least supposed to try. And we knew enough to be ashamed when we got it wrong. But things changed in 1980. Things changed in the 1980s. Now, all of you who are students anyway, or I should say none of you are 20th century people. You're 21st century people. You will live the majority of your lives in the 21st century, and some of you weren't even born in the 20th century. So none of you should live lives at the effect of or burdened by the bad ideas of the 20th century. Just like at about the age you are now, you go to therapy or whatever you do to investigate your family origins, to investigate what was happening in your family dynamic before you got here. This is part of your own individuation process. You figure out what your parents got right and what they got right. You go, well, that's cool. I'm going to continue on that one. I want to be, standing on the shoulders of those giants, and I want to do that even better than my parents did, and I want to pass that on to my children. But other things you see that your parents did, and you go, oh, that chain needs to break right here. I don't want that particular neurotic pattern to affect me for the rest of my life, and I sure as heck don't want to pass it on to my children. That's not only how individuals individuate and mature, it's also how cultures mature. That you look at what was before, and you look at it very consciously and very honestly, and you say, well, that was good. We want to take that forward. And other things you look at and you go, that was really bad, and that needs to stop right here. What I want to talk to you about tonight is some things that have been happening in the last 40 years in this country. I want to talk to you about what they are. I want to talk to you about the terrible damage they've done, and hopefully enroll you in the idea that many of those things are things that need to stop right here. It was in the 1980s that the entire economic philosophy of trickle-down economics burst onto the scene. Tremendous power, tremendous political power, tremendous financial power behind it. The idea that the only responsibility of the corporation should be financial responsibility, financial to the short-term profit-making of the stockholders. Now, before that, you might not believe me, kids, but the U.S. corporation was actually, believe it or not, expected to care. Before the 1980s, if somebody had worked for a corporation for decades, it was understood that that corporation, of course, would care whether or not that person had a dignified retirement. Social attitudes like that, infused into our economic functioning, are the glue that create some harmony, that holds some things together. But once in the 1980s, this idea of this trickle-down economics became so prominent, what happened was the idea that of a completely amoral stance on the part of the U.S. corporation appeared to be justified. All they should have to care about was fiduciary responsibility to their stockholders, even if it was at the expense of the workers, and even if it was at the expense of the environment, even if it was at the expense of the community. Now, it moved on, Because then, within the next 10 to 20 years, this economic theory and the money that those corporate forces that were promulgating that theory represented, they were able to use that money in an explosive power that had never existed before to so wield influence in Washington that our government became, for all intents and purposes, handmaiden to those corporate forces. And thus began the slide. Thus began the slide from what would have been seen as at least a pretty, somewhat vital democracy to what we have today. We are not a vital, functioning democracy. We have regressed. We have reverted. We are a functioning corporate aristocracy. We have a corporate matrix made of health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies and gun manufacturers and chemical companies and oil and gas and defense contractors. And the way not only our economy works, but now this system has so corrupted our government that how our government works is that first they advocate through all manner of public policy. That has to do with tax policies, corporate subsidies, and so forth. First, they advocate for the safety, the health, and the well-being of the stockholders and the profitability, short-term profitability of the corporation. Afterwards, whatever is left, everyone else can scramble and try to get what's possible. This has caused a massive transfer of wealth in the United States from a time in the 70s when wealth inequality was not an issue. What I just described to you has caused a massive transfer of wealth into the hands of the proverbial 1%, to the point where 1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90%. The idea of trickle-down economics was that, okay, you're going to give all this money to stockholders, but this is so great because they're going to create so many jobs. Jobs are going to fall from their table like crumbs from Mount Olympus. They perched at their aristocratic table, and all these jobs would trickle down, and it would lift all boats. I think after 40 years, you can consider the jury in. It not only did not lift all boats, it has left millions and millions and millions of people without even a life vest. It has destroyed America's middle class. It has created the greatest wealth inequality in almost 100 years. And when we talk about the 90% and talk about the fact that 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%, this is not just data. These are not just numbers on a sheet of paper. This represents unbelievable human suffering and chronic economic tension and anxiety. We have 41 million people in America living in poverty, and we have 93 million Americans living in near poverty. We have 13 million hungry children. 13 million food insecure children in this, the richest country in the world. We have 100,000 homeless children. We have millions of American children who live in chronic trauma, many of whom live in what's called America's domestic war zones, where the violence in their homes, on their streets, even in their schools is so great that psychologists tell us that they are experiencing a form of PTSD that is no less severe than the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq. What are we doing about these children? Well, I'll tell you what the political establishment is doing. The political establishment, remember, is handmaiden to an economic system that represents a virulent strain of capitalism. I'm not capitalist at all. I'm not anti-capitalist at all. I'm for capitalism with a conscience. What we're talking about here is a malfunction that I don't believe is inherent in capitalism. But as I said, it's a virulent strain. That virulent strain of capitalism has no use for anyone that doesn't serve it. And the two main groups of our population that do not serve that virulent strain and therefore get short shrift from the government, who exists mainly to support that economic system because that's where the donations come from, are children and the elderly. So all that the political system has done about these millions and millions of children living in chronic trauma is to normalize their despair. They're not old enough to vote, so they don't represent a constituency. They're not old enough to work, so they don't have any financial leverage. And if you don't have any financial leverage, how do you possibly compete with the cloud of all the corporate money that dominates Washington today? As president, I want a United States Department of Children and Youth. The challenges and the vulnerabilities of the traumatized American child are far too great to be adequately addressed by our Department of Education. We have children who are traumatized even before preschool. We have children in elementary school on suicide watch. We need trauma-informed education. We need community wraparound services. We need social and emotional learning. We need conflict resolution. We need anti-bullying. We need violence prevention. We need restorative justice. We need mindfulness in the schools. And if you want, and I want for you the most amazing economy and the most amazing society and the most amazing chapter in American history. I want it right up there in the years when you are living at full blossom. The key to having the most stunning society and the most stunning economy 10 years from now is to take better care of your 10-year-olds today. We should have a massive realignment of investments in the direction of America's children. There is no fuel for the amazing future that we all want. There is no fuel in the wind, there is no fuel in the sun, there's no fuel in anything under the ground that can even match the fuel that is the development of the brain of every child. Every school in America should be a palace of learning, a palace of culture, and a palace of the arts. We must get rid of this horrifying way that we primarily base our educational funding on property taxes. That means if you come, thank you. So if you come from a financially well-to-do family, you stand a very good chance of a high-quality public school education in America. If you don't come from a well-to-do family, you stand more of a chance to be one of the children whose classrooms don't even have glue sticks and paper, or even worse, the classrooms where where there are not the adequate school supplies to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. In the richest country in the world, to withhold education from a child for no other reason than that that child does not have well-to-do parents is a form of passive oppression. This generation, and by this generation, I mean your generation. You know, the older you are, the more you know some things. And the younger you are, the more you know other things. What happens when you're young is you know more about what's happening now. When you're older, you know more about the things that keep happening and that repeat themselves. And there's shared wisdom there that is very necessary in order for us to wage the kind of political revolution that is necessary in America today. We need to recognize that the actualization, the full actualization of the brain, the life of every child should be seen as our highest national priority. Our generation, and that means your generation, needs to rebond emotionally and psychologically with the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence forms our mission statement. But if those ideas are inscribed on marble walls and yet or on parchment somewhere behind glass, but they're not inscribed in our hearts, then they lose their force. And that is what has happened. They have lost their moral force. If principles are not alive inside you, they are not alive at all. And when we understand about the history of our country, just like I was talking about understanding about the history of your family, you begin to see where you sit, where you stand, who you are in the larger narrative of what came before and where you stand in the larger narrative of what will come after. And when we do revisit those first principles and we do revisit how they came to be and what was happening at the time, we get a much clearer picture of what is going on today, including what is going on that there are so many hungry children, including what is going on that there is such a desecrated earth, including what is going on that there is such racial turbulence, including what is going on that our national security agenda is so driven by corporate profits for defense contractors rather than agenda for creating peace. So let's go back to 1776. In 1776, some very brave men got together, and they signed, and they were brave because they were risking their lives to sign that document. If the British had won the war, they would have been executed as traitors. They signed a document that placed within the founding of this country the most aspirational and enlightened principles that had ever formed the core of the founding of a nation. It was radical, what they said. It was radical then, and it's radical now. It was a complete repudiation of aristocracy. It was the statement that there weren't just a few who were entitled, that all men are created equal, that all men have the unalienable rights given them by God to life and to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness. And then it goes on, even more radical, that it is the role of government, that governments are instituted to secure those rights, and that if government's not doing its job, it is the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it. Those are our core principles. But that's also where things got gnarly, because out of the 56 signers of the Declaration, 41 of them were slave owners. The point is, we have always been, in every generation we have always been, including ours, we have always been both. We are both a nation founded on the most aspirational, enlightened principles that have ever formed the core ideal of a nation, and we have been and continue to be, in our own way, in our own time, in certain ways, the most violent perpetrator of transgression against those principles. It's a bipolar characterological aspect of the American consciousness. It's in our DNA. It's the story that every generation plays out. It's the choice that confronts every generation as we decide who we wish to be and what chapter we wish to write in the longer ongoing narrative. Now remember, slavery was responded to by abolition, and the suppression of women was responded to by the women's suffragette movement. And institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South was responded to by the civil rights movement. But also note that in all of those cases, the change did not come from the government. The change was initiated by the people. The U.S. government, the U.S. government didn't wake up one day and decide to end slavery. The U.S. government didn't wake up one day and say, oh, let's give women the right to vote. The U.S. government didn't wake up one day and say, let's desegregate. What happened in each one of those cases, the abolitionist movement, the women's suffragette movement, and the civil rights movement, was that the people rose up and the people stepped in. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, we repudiated aristocracy in 1776. It is time to repudiate it again, and we once again in our generation are challenged by the fact that whether for us it's hungry children, unnecessarily hungry children, 93 million Americans living in chronic economic trauma, not knowing what will happen if they get sick, not knowing what will happen if one of their kids gets sick, not knowing what to do to send their kids to college, or not knowing how to get out from under these college loans, whether it is mass incarceration or racial disparity in criminal sentencing, whether it is mandatory minimums that should not be there or the desecration of the earth, whether it is the fact that our entire national security agenda is based basically on defense contractor profits rather than the cultivation of peace, or rather it is the fact that our very pillars of democracy are under an assault by a shameless and narcissistic person who happens to be in a role waging way too much power given the contempt that he displays for democracy itself. It is time, once again, for the people to step in. First, having recognized the extraordinary economic injustice that underlies so much of this, realizing that the money in politics is the cancer underlying all the cancer, realizing that the money in politics is married to this corporate aristocratic economic system, we have to begin where we have to begin. Number one, we need to repeal the 2017 tax cut that gave 83 cents of every dollar to the richest corporations and individuals. From what I've heard today, that will probably be some of you. That's okay, you'll probably won't even feel it. We need to put back in the middle class tax cut because it should have been there to begin with, should not have been there. We need to end the corporate subsidies by which we gave $26 billion to oil and gas alone last year. The United States government needs to claim its capacity, its ability, its legal right to negotiate for lower drug prices with big pharmaceutical companies. And we need to say to the U.S. military, how much do you need? Because every dollar that they need, they should get. But you know the hundreds of billions of dollars over and above what the military says it needs that has to do only with short-term profit maximization for defense contractors, the proverbial military-industrial complex, that needs to go away. To anybody who has $1 billion, happy for you if you made it righteously. However, we'd like 3% on your taxes of $1 billion. Don't worry about it, they won't even feel it. Also, if somebody has 50 million or more, it also makes sense, 2% tax on that which is over and above 50 million. Once we do those things, we're gonna have some cash on hand. And when we have some cash on hand, we're gonna do, number one, we're gonna have that Department of that Department of Children and Youth. Number two, we will have free health care, but we're going to have more than free health care. We have to face the fact, as you might have heard me say on the debate stage, we don't have a health care system, ladies and gentlemen. We have a sickness care system, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else. 86 cents of every dollar that we spend on health care actually goes towards treating a sickness which wouldn't even exist except that it is a chronic illness caused in part by unhealthy lifestyle and unhealthy food that is so endemic to our food system in the United States. So in order for us to really address health care, we need to address health. I don't want to just be a president who provides health care. I want to be a president who helps provide greater opportunity for health. So that means we have to address the food companies. We have to address our food policies and our chemical policies. The fact that there's so many contaminants in our water and so many carcinogens in our food and so many toxins in our air and so forth. In other words, we can't just address health care. We have to ask ourselves, why exactly are so many Americans sick? Especially given the fact that so many of the chronic illnesses that we have in the United States are at such a higher rate than are experienced by citizens in other advanced democracies. We need to make college free for every American, and we need to simply get rid of those college loans. But it's not just that I want free health care. It's not just that I want free college, and it's not just that I want to remove the college loans. It's why we should do those things. We should do those things because we should shift from an economic bottom line to a humanitarian bottom line. This is the 21st century, and this is exactly what I meant when I said you should not be burdened by the bad ideas of the 20th century. In the 20th century, they said, improve your economy in order to improve the state of your humanity. What I'm saying to you is improve the state of humanity in order to improve your economy. Money does not come. Money does not come from crumbs dropped from the table of corporate aristocrats on Mount Olympus somewhere. Money comes from the creativity and the productivity of the American people. That's why I want children to self-actualize, and that's why I want you to self-actualize. The reason I want to say to a younger generation such as yourself, I don't even want you to have to worry about health care. I don't even want you to even have to worry about college loans. I don't want you to have to worry about that. But there is a quid pro quo here. It's not like I think your government and your society should invest all that in you so that you can just hang. The point is you can have those things so that you are supported, not thwarted, as American citizens are right now so often. American citizens are thwarted by public policy from actualizing their dreams. The truth of the matter is, if you are set up to succeed, if you are set up to spread your wings, if you are set up to soar, if you are set up to actualize your God-given potential, America will be better off. That is how we have peace in 10 to 20 years. That is how we have prosperity in 10 to 20 years. If your government can do everything possible to allow you the space to become all that you can be. When you have millions of Americans who are in jobs that they hate, but they're just there because they have to for the health benefits. You have millions of Americans who have to work 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet. You have millions of Americans who are going down career paths that aren't even what they want, not even what their hearts are crying out for, but they're doing it only because otherwise I don't see how they could get out from under those college loans, forming a $1.5 trillion college loan debt. That creates so much tension, so much anxiety. So then the system, the political system says, what are we going to do about that about that mental health crisis? I have an idea for what we should do about the mental health crisis. Stop driving so many people crazy. It's like everything else. It's like everything else. Where do you think the mental health crisis comes from? Is the fact that there's such despair. There's such isolation. There is so much tension. There is so much anxiety. We have to address these issues on the level of cause and not just on the level of symptom. If you treat these problems just on the level of symptom, you end up creating profit centers for the problem creators. And you call them problem solvers, but they were actually the problem creators because the entire economic system that they represent helped to create the problem. We need a World War II level mass mobilization to reverse climate change. Nothing less than that will do. We have 12 years. We need to get radical. We need to shift from a dirty economy to a clean economy. Everybody here, I'm sure, is very aware of what we need to do. We need to reforest. We need to sequester the carbon. We need to invest in clean energy, replace those power grids. We need to deal with animal factory farming. If we don't deal with the animal factory farming, then even if we did all the other things I mentioned, we would still be in a situation where the nitrous oxide and the methane gas would get to us. It's very important, once again, with all these things, it's not going to be enough to just change policy. We have to change our thinking. We all need to get what is at stake here. If we do not make these changes, we could be facing, within 15 to 20 years, a level of massive social collapse unlike anything seen in the modern era. There could be whole swaths of countries and possibly whole swaths of continents that are uninhabitable because of the heat. If the heat is so great that the land is uninhabitable, that means obviously that food cannot be grown there. That means massive food shortages. That means economic collapse. That means a level of environmental refugees that could be up to the hundreds of millions. Right now, we have 63 million displaced persons on the planet. That represents the largest humanitarian refugee crisis since World War II. Now, in order for the United States to have this kind of massive World War II enrollment, this will take a change in our thinking. This will take a change in how we see ourselves in relation to our country. This is a time of crisis, and I know that that's not convenient. Crisis is never convenient, but crisis can also be transformative. Sometimes it's when we get bad news that we realize how intelligent that we are. I think one of the problems that Americans have, one of the problems that actually is a root cause for much of the despair, much of the societal dysfunction and even malfunction that we have in America today, is that people are so isolated. People are so hungry for love, basically. And when we all face the fact that we need a season of moral repair, we are going to fix our infrastructure. We're going to turn from a dirty economy to a clean economy. We're going to deal at a deeper level with racial reconciliation, and we are going to deal with an entirely new paradigm shift in terms of our national security. It will be a big job, but it will be a job worthy of who we are. Americans are not weary because we're doing too much. Americans are weary because we're not taking on big things. We were hardwired for big things. We're hardwired for great things. And it's small things, it's incremental change that makes our eyes glaze over. We have some big things to do, and that's what I'm talking to you about tonight. In addition to the Department of Children and Youth, in addition to this massive realignment of resources in the direction of our children, in addition to not only a Green New Deal, but even going beyond that in terms of a massive enrollment in order to address climate reversal, we need to take on the subject of race in our time in a deeper way than this country has done in decades. I do not think the average American is a racist. That's not my experience, and it's not my belief. But it is my experience and my belief that the average white American is vastly underinformed and undereducated about race in the United States. Now, I believe the Americans are good people. I think we're good people. I think we're decent people. I don't think we're better than other people, but I think we're as good and as decent as anyone. The problem is the divergence between who we are and the way our government operates. And that's the problem, particularly in a representative democracy where theoretically the role of government is to represent the consciousness or the will of the people. But right now, as we've already established, the government does more to represent the consciousness and the will of huge corporate forces. We need to close that gap. When it comes to race, the people are good, the people are ready, and this is what I believe we need to do. In 1619, the first slave ships came here, and slavery was not abolished in the United States until 1865. That's just shy of 250 years. At the end of slavery, historians believe there were between 4 and 5 million formerly enslaved people. General Tecumseh Sherman promised to every former slave family of 4, 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule would have given someone who had been a slave and is a slave no longer a chance to start their life over. Federal troops were stationed in the American South to ensure that slavery would not be reinstituted, but they were taken away in 1877. A lot of this would have been very different had Lincoln lived. During that 12 years between the end of the Civil War and 1877 when the federal troops left, pretty amazing things were happening in the South. There were black senators, there were black congresspeople, and so forth. As soon as the federal troops left, the white Southern legislatures passed throughout the South what were called the Black Code Laws. Black Code Laws meant that there would be subpar economic, social, and political opportunities for black people. And so, you have 250 years of slavery, and then for the next 100 years, except for those 12 years, you had another 100 years, an era of institutionalized violence against black people. What do you call lynchings? What do you call Ku Klux Klan if not domestic terrorism? 350 years of institutionalized violence against black people. That's longer than this country has been in existence. It was 100 years after the end of the Civil War. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. That dismantled segregation. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which ensured equal access to the polls. What happened after that? In many ways, there's been improvement. In many ways, improvement, like I said to you, when I was in college here, was like a big deal. I mean, some of the racial things that were happening even in my lifetime. I'm not saying that improvements have not been made, but clearly in other ways, we're actually sliding backwards. Mass incarceration is sliding backwards. Racial disparity in criminal sentencing is sliding backwards. Mandatory minimums is sliding backwards. And since 2013, when the John Roberts-led Supreme Court began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, we've had a spate of voter suppression efforts, which clearly is targeted in large part to communities of color. Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations since the end of World War II. It does not mean that the Holocaust didn't happen, but it has gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. Also in 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act, whereby all the surviving prisoners of the Japanese internment camps were paid between $20,000 and $22,000. All of this is just to point out that by the middle of the 20th century, it was totally accepted that if one people had harmed another, economic remuneration was reasonable. It was what you do. And so when you look at the economic gap that existed at the end of the Civil War, when you look at the fact that it has never been closed, when you look at all of the ways when, even when there was effort to accumulate black wealth, in many cases, state and local laws would actually thwart those efforts. I think it's reasonable for us to understand why it is that racial turbulence, underlying racial turbulence, as well as externalized racial turbulence, is like a baton that we just pass one generation to another. The reason I want to be president is because I want to help this country end an aberrational chapter of our history and begin a new one in many areas, just like the economics that we have been talking about. In terms of race, whether you are a country or an individual, you can't have the future you want if you're not willing to clean up the past. I want to stop just giving one generation, here's our racial turbulence baton, you take it. And then you hold it, and then you'll give it to your kids. And as much as we are all talking these days about white privilege and understanding white privilege and atoning in our hearts, you know what? If you took $1,000 from me, I would appreciate the apology, but I would still like my money back. So it is time for us to move beyond atonement, as important as atonement is, beyond apology, as important apology is, and make some amends. It is time to pay reparations for slavery. My plan is for $500 billion that would be dispersed over 20 years through a Reparations Council. It would be the job of this Reparations Council, all of the members, of course, would be themselves descendants of slaves, to decide how that money is dispersed. But the stipulation on the part of the United States government would be that the money is to be used for purposes of economic and educational renewal. I'd also like to remind you that the money itself, dispersed that way, will be an economic stimulus. It's been established that if black families made as much money as white families, our economy would be $1.5 trillion larger. And the last pillar of what I think of as a moral politics that will initiate a season of moral repair in this country has to do with that national security agenda. We now spend $760 billion a year on our military. We spend $40 billion a year on our State Department. That's diplomacy and mediation and development. And then within the State Department, within that $40 billion, we spend $17 billion on the USAID, and that's long-term development and humanitarian assistance. Then in addition to that $17 billion, within the $40 billion is less than $1 billion that is given to the peace-building agencies. Now, we need what is the equivalent of the health and wellness space in healing the physical body. We need the equivalent of that in healing the body politic. In your body, we've long moved into a more holistic, integrative approach to healing the body. You can't just take medicine, you also have to cultivate health. Sickness is the absence of health. Health is not the absence of sickness. And the same with war and peace. We can't just keep preparing for war and hope that maybe one day we will back up into peace. You're living in a generation, you don't even remember a time, most of you, that we weren't at war. And so it has become a consistent wartime mentality is normalized. And that's why as an older woman, I want to say, no, don't get used to this. Don't get used to this. Don't fall asleep. They want you to feel that, oh, well, this is just normal. No, it's actually not normal. And war, conflict, is the absence of peace. Peace is not the absence of war. And so I want a United States Department of Peace. I want a U.S. Peace Academy, just like we have a U.S. Military Academy. Because peace-building tools and peace-building expertise and peace-building skills are just as sophisticated as our military skills. And in some of the places where they're employed, they take just as much courage. We need those peace-building skills on the streets of the United States, and we need those peace-building skills internationally as well. When I have a National Security Council, I don't want just the military. I don't want just the people who are playing war games. I also want people who are playing peace games. And I know that it is the military itself which would be very grateful for this. My critique is not of military decisions. I'm a great fan of the U.S. military. I think we should all be very grateful. Obviously, my father fought in World War II. The things I'm talking about here are not military decisions. They are political decisions. They are simply expressions of the same corporate aristocracy that has infused everything else. So you see, I think that the idea of a staid, traditional political perspective, that's of yesteryear. That's over. And I also don't think that it's enough to defeat Donald Trump. The president has ushered in an era of political theater, and we will not be going back. I think that where this is one of those times when a safe choice is one of the most dangerous things you could possibly do. This is a president who I'm afraid to say that there are examples here of outrageous lies. And I think the only thing to override outrageous lies is outrageous truth. And the only thing that can override outrageous fear is outrageous love. You see, we're living at a time when the emotional and psychological frequency of politics at this moment must be addressed, and we must be able to rise to the level of that kind of phenomenal energy. This man has introduced a phenomenon. This is a phenomenon. This is not just politics as usual. And we need to answer that with a phenomenon of our own. And the only thing that can override collectivized hatred and collectivized fear is collectivized love and collectivized conscience. It is when we do more than tell the truth. All of the candidates are telling you the truth. I have a lot of respect for the other candidates. You should do your due diligence. You should listen to them all, because California has early voting. So you are essentially, for all intents and purposes, an early primary state now. This gives you tremendous responsibility and it gives you tremendous power. I'm not saying that any of them are lying to you because they're all telling you the truth. But I am saying that, in my opinion, we need to do more than tell the truth now. We need to be more like in a court of law when you raise your hand and you tell the truth and you tell the whole truth and you tell nothing but the truth. And that's what I feel I'm talking to you about tonight. Some truths that many find inconvenient. Some truths that it's kind of difficult to look at. But you're adults now. You can handle it. I have no doubt that if someone in your room, in your house, was in big trouble, perhaps somebody was drinking too much, perhaps somebody was taking drugs too much. Most of you already are at a point in your life where you're part of that rather unfortunately common American phenomenon when we all know what the word intervention means. We have all seen enough or heard enough to know that the survival of the body, the physical body, cannot be guaranteed if in fact through drugs or alcohol or anything else, the body is abused too much. Well, it's only magical thinking for any of us to think that the survival of our democracy could be guaranteed. And it's also magical thinking to think that if we continue to behave the way we are towards the earth itself, that the survival of our species could be guaranteed. We need an intervention. We need an intervention. We need to rise up the way the abolitionists rose up. We need to rise up the way the women suffragettes rose up. We need to rise up the way the civil rights movement rose up. It was when people stepped in. And I want to end by saying that I read a book called The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd. Many of you might have read her book that was very popular called The Secret Life of Bees. And this book was about two women who actually lived called the Grimke sisters. And the Grimke sisters were actual people who were born into a slave-owning family in Charleston, South Carolina. And yet they were among those whose eyes were opened. They were converted by the Quakers, and they became leading abolitionists and leading feminists. And what the book made me think about, something I had never really thought about before, was the difference, the real difference between someone who was anti-slavery and someone who was actually an abolitionist. Anti-slavery just meant you didn't agree with it. Anti-slavery just meant you would never do that, and you would never live in a slave-owning state, and you wouldn't own another human being, and you thought the whole thing was terrible. That would be a noble sentiment, but that would not of itself have moved the needle for even one enslaved human being. Some people, however, have crossed a bridge, and that bridge is inside yourself. It's in your head and it's in your heart. It's a moral bridge. It's an emotional bridge. It's a psychological bridge. It's from a ground of being within yourself where you say, I don't agree, to a ground of being within yourself where you say, not on my watch. And you see, that's where we are right now. I didn't tell you anything tonight that you don't already know. I might have mentioned a few details that you don't know, but you don't. It's not like you don't know. It's not like anybody here doesn't know that we have traumatized children. It's not like anybody here doesn't know about any of these things that we're talking about. The era of data collection is over. This is not a moment when it's about finding out what we don't know. It's about to owning up to what we do know, rising up to the challenge of doing something about what we know. And I'm asking you to join with me. We need to move from, oh, we don't agree with those things, to a fierce and convicted thing. That conviction that is too often displayed by hate and is displayed by hatred today. There's nothing more dangerous than collectivized hatred. But there are a lot more lovers in this country than there are haters. The problem we have is that the haters display more conviction now than is displayed by the lovers. So when you have a few haters who hate with conviction, and you have a lot of lovers, kind of, sort of, sometimes when it's about me, committed to love, then the hate will create more political force. We need to display as much conviction behind our love today as some people display behind their hate. When we do that, I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's a narcissistic, shameless president. I don't care if it's Cambridge Analytica. I don't care if it's the Russians, I don't care what it is. Nothing will be able to stand as long as enough people rise up, enough people really get it in our hearts, enough people really get it in our guts, enough people vote, and we make clear in a way that would make our ancestors proud. You know those things we just talked about tonight? Not on our watch. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you again for coming down. Again, just to reintroduce ourselves, I'm Mark Rod. I'm a senior at Pomona, and I'm one of the managing editors for TSL.
I'm Hershey Surrey. I'm a third year at Pomona College, and I'm a politics liaison for the department.
Why don't we just get started? As you mentioned earlier, you used to be a student here at Pomona. Do you think there's any experiences or lessons or things that you learned here at Pomona that you've that have really shaped your life since then?
I mentioned earlier tonight a man named Stanley Crouch. And I remember I can't remember exactly the department that he was part of. It was partly with the theater department. I was a double major in theater and philosophy. And I remember he had tremendous effect on my life and my politicalization. I had been brought up in a very left-wing family with a lot of focus on social justice, but it was still a polite and privileged upbringing that did not enable me to have the kind of expanded vision I got from him. Also, there was a philosophy professor named Steve Erickson at the time, from whom I learned so much. There were people here who taught me much, yes.
You've taken a very non-traditional path to the presidential primary. How have your previous experiences and professions prepared you both for campaigning and for the position in the executive branch?
I have spent 35 years of a career very up close and personal with people in their moments of crisis. And particularly over the last 15 years, I've seen how many of these crises are due, at least in large part, to bad public policy. So, sometimes when I see congressmen and senators taking some foreign jaunt over to, let's say, somewhere in the Middle East, while I think that those jaunts are important, sometimes I wish they'd take more jaunts to the inner city of the United States. They ought to take a trip sometime to the inner city of Chicago. They ought to take a trip somewhere to the inner city of Los Angeles, et cetera. And I have heard politicians talking so often in ways about symptoms and policy changes that just have made me feel you have no real clue, do you? You have no real clue as to what's going on. I challenge the idea that only those whose whose careers have been entrenched within the political system, the mindset of which drove us into this ditch, are the only people qualified to lead us out of it. It's not about the individuals at all. It's simply that the political system itself is so concentrated on the trees that it does not see the virus that has infected the entire forest. Now, in the U.S. Constitution, it says that in order to be qualified for the presidency, you have to have been born here, you had to have lived here for at least 14 years, and you have to be at least 35 years old. It does not say you have to have been a congressman or a senator or a governor. And that is because they were leaving it to every generation to determine for itself the skill set most needed to navigate the times in which we live. I believe that my skill set and my experience gives me a qualification that is not only both unique, but even more relevant to the times in which we live. Political mechanics are important, they're necessary, and I respect that. And I'm a Democrat. I feel that the political mechanics of the Democratic Party, including many of the people who are running, are definitely to be desired. They're to be desired in your vice president. They're to be desired in your administration. They're to be desired in your cabinet position. But right now, in the role of the president, we need a political visionary, even more than we need another political mechanic. You know, very experienced politicians took us into Iraq. Very experienced politicians took us into Vietnam. It wasn't an absence of political experience, it was an absence of moral certitude. You can have the best car mechanic in the world, but the car mechanic doesn't necessarily know what road you should take. And FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, said that the primary responsibility of and job of the president, he said, is moral leadership. He said the administrative aspect of the job is secondary. Not private morality. Private morality, I don't think the government should have any say whatsoever. But there are issues of public morality. If you even look at this current president, I don't think that his problem is a lack of experience. His problem is a lack of ethics. His problem is a lack of visceral taste for democracy, apparently. And so I believe that what I have been through and experienced for the last 35 years is exactly what makes me qualified. Not only to discern the deeper dynamics of a problem, but to determine the deeper transformational elements which are necessary in order to fix the problem, and to talk to large groups of people about how together we can make real change.
You spoke earlier about issues of mental health in this country, especially among children. You've also previously spoken out against the use of antidepressants, and you've questioned clinical definitions of the difference between depression and sadness. What do you think is the proper way that we should be treating mental health in this country if clinicians sometimes have it wrong and if drugs aren't the answer?
Well, first of all, it's not correct to say I have spoken out against antidepressants. Look at what has happened with the opioid crisis. The problem wasn't the existence of painkillers. Painkillers have a place. The problem was the predatory practices on the part of big pharmaceutical companies so that opioids were overprescribed and leading to the overprescription, over-manufactured, and so forth. That's why there are attorneys general all over the country that are now indicting big pharmaceutical executives because we know that these practices occurred. I don't know why we would be assuming, especially given what we know about predatory practices on the part of big pharmaceutical companies, I don't know why we would be assuming that they would have such a dastardly agenda for nothing short of just greedy profit-making purposes. Why should we assume that they had that dastardly agenda regarding painkillers, but that in every other area they are so pure? I think we should have jets as well. I think Boeing should make jets. But do I believe that the FAA should have been obviously looking the other way in the situation that led to the Boeing MAX disasters? No. So I have questioned what's going on. You know, in my career, I'm not someone who gives answers, but it is my job to ask questions. And I think it is a reasonable question to ask. What is going on? The prevalence of the use of antidepressants in situations that are that have been traditionally associated with the normal spectrum of human despair. Same with painkillers. You could have, and that's how a lot of people got hooked. You know, you could have, my finger is sore. It might be sore, but maybe an aspirin would be a better idea than a week of OxyContin. Well, the same thing here. You know, you go through a divorce. It's painful, but it's not a mental illness. You go through the loss of a friend, it's not a mental illness. You're in your 20s. It's difficult, but it's not a mental illness. So I know something about that, and during the years that I was here. So I have questioned, I have simply pointed out that we have become, as a society, we have developed a prejudice against sadness. And sometimes, even in the happiest life, there are sad days, and there are sad occurrences. So I have talked about the fact that we as a society have become so dissociated from our own pain, so desensitized to our own pain, which actually leads us to even worse problems, because if you're more desensitized to your own pain, you're more likely to be desensitized to the pain in people of places like, Iraq. And so, yes, I have engaged in my books in a conversation about that is no different than many health professionals have engaged in. So I haven't questioned the reality of clinical depression at all. And some people are very much helped by antidepressants, and I've never said anything to be a judgment about that whatsoever. I've never questioned anyone's use of medicine. I'm Jewish, I go to the doctor. So all that sort of narrative about she's anti-medicine or anti-science or any of that is completely bogus. Did that answer that question? Thank you.
In a previous interview with The Student Life over the summer, you said Trump's election was a response to a cry for change from the American people that still exists. What change specifically do you think the American people are looking for, and why do you believe that you are the one to bring that change?
Well, first of all, I stay away from I am the one. That sounds like Trump right there. Remember his I am the only one who can fix it. I'm not saying I'm the only one who can fix it. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I have a particular view, a particular agenda. I'm laying it out for you, and then it's really up to you. I mean, it's up to the American people to decide what your choice is. I'm not saying I'm the only one. I'm saying I have my particular ideas, other candidates have theirs, and you should vote according to your own conscience. Now, in terms of the cry for change, the reason there was such a populist cry of despair 2 years ago was because people knew the system was rigged. Their rage was legitimate. It was rigged in all the ways that we've been talking about here tonight. And I felt a deep concern because both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump named the rage. And I felt there was going to be a cry of despair expressing that rage. I felt it would either be expressed in the election of an authoritarian populist or a progressive populist. But I had deep concerns that a woman who wasn't even naming the rage, people want to feel seen. And we particularly want to feel our pain is seen. And so I had a real sense that that somebody's going to have to speak to this. Now, what has happened, of course, is he's been the worst kind of change agent. And the rigging has not been ameliorated. If anything, the screws have even been tightened. So we still need that change. We still need that structural change. And when it comes only to the structural change on an economic level, there are at least a couple of other candidates who would bring that about as effectively as I would.
So despite the attention that you've received, especially in the wake of the first two debates, you're still around 1% in most polls, and you're trailing most of your competitors in fundraising. Why do you think this is, and what's your plan for getting yourself ahead and getting yourself in becoming a front runner prior to the first few primaries?
After the second debate, I was the most Googled person in 49 states. I hope you realize that the state that I was not the most Googled in was Montana, and Montana's governor was on the stage. So clearly people in Montana said, who is he? He's a governor? He's our governor? And I think that's hilarious. And so for a couple of days, there was a lot of talk about me, about my candidacy. There was a lot of interest. And then starting the third day, the hatchet came down. You could hardly pick up a newspaper, magazine, turn on your computer that there wasn't anything about what a dangerous, crazy lady I am. That I'm anti-vax, that I'm anti-science, that I'm anti-medicine, that I'm a wacko crystal lady, that was meant not, at first it was funny because it was not malevolent, and then it got not funny at all because it was intentional. It came from a whole other place. Dangerous, crazy, grifter, and that was a smear intended to place in the minds of reasonable Democrats particularly the idea that I'm the last person you could take seriously. And it had its desired effects. And so the interest just plunged. It turned from this initial excitement and interest, and there were forces that saw that excitement and interest, and for reasons it should be obvious to anyone who heard what I said tonight. I'm sure at this point, now that you've heard me tonight, I don't need to tell you how inconvenient my ideas are to the prevailing establishment. And they said, we've got to shut this down now. And they did, in terms of their situation with the polls and all of that, with which they seek to narrow the field, basically, to their club. But enough people, first of all, saw how all that went down last time, and enough people have continued to come to my events, have continued to donate, enough to keep me in the race. I feel that the ideas I'm talking about, I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought these ideas were important. Martin Luther King said, your life begins to end on the day you stop talking about things that matter. I feel that the things we're talking about here tonight really matter. There are two different political universes. One is all of that, and the debate stage. All it is a reality TV show. It's like a boxing match. Is Biden going to be up against Warren Sanders? I mean, and it's in cahoots within the mainstream media and so forth. They're important for a candidate because that's where the eyeballs are. But that's all the more reason why I believe if there are 20 candidates, so you do it on 2 nights. I believe that the American people should have the opportunity to hear all of us. And this particularly puts at disadvantage those of us who are non-establishment candidates, because even those of you in this room tonight, even those of you who might have agreed with things I said or liked things I said, you still have like, wait, how does this work? Because she hasn't been in, you have to, wait, how does this work? There's a lot to process. I understand that. And that's all the more reason you should have the time to do the processing. So that has certainly affected me in terms of my fundraising, although I have made enough money that I can be here, that I can continue to exist. What I do not have is the $1 million that I need to get on TV over these next 3 months. And that's what I really need. And so I hope that anybody either here tonight or anybody watching on live stream will go to Marianne2020.com and donate so that we can make that $1 million so that we can get on TV ads. Even Andrew Yang tweeted tonight, send her money so she can get on TV, which I thought was so wonderful. So wonderful that he did that. That's the kind of mentality us outsiders have.
Earlier tonight, you said that you believe that the current problems that we're facing in our society are a result of prevailing thoughts of older generations, or
Of what, I'm sorry?
of older generations, as in like past mistakes given by the older people.
No,
the past presidents and the older ideology of
well, yes, I was
different
talking
administrations.
about trickle-down economics and what's been
Yes.
happening for the last 40 years. Some good things happened too, but the last 40 years of economics, yes.
Yes. The question that I have to follow up to that is, you say that right now we're living in a more progressive time that should respond to the younger ideologies, correct?
I'm not so sure young and, when you look at I'm not so sure it's a division between younger and older, actually, because I'm not sure it can be divided that way. What I did say is that we're living in the 21st century. And in the 21st century, the mindset is very different than the 20th. It's very much whole person, very much more integrative, very much more multidimensional. And I did say that. I don't want to keep it to the age of the body, but the consciousness of the mind, yes, it's new, it's regenerative, it's much more progressive in the 21st century.
My follow-up question to that is, how do you feel like you relate to the new progressive ideologies of this time, and how are you going to bring that into the executive branch?
I think I'm one of the main people who has articulated it for our time. That's what my books have been part of. That's been my career for the last 35 years. I think I'm one of the people who has written the books who have popularized the kind of progressive spirituality and understanding, which I believe is the appropriate context for the times, cultural understanding of our times. The current political establishment is too narrow. It is too superficial a container for the level of inquiry and conversation and energy that we need to exhibit now. And my career has been someone who articulates that deeper level of conversation and works with it in its practical application in the lives of individuals and systems.
Going back to your first Democratic debate that was televised, you criticized your opponent's focus on plans. Why do you think it's detrimental to the party to focus on specific policy proposals, especially since earlier in this event, you referred to the big job we have to undertake?
Well, once again, be clear. I was talking about a focus on plans if we plan to defeat Donald Trump. Obviously, we need plans. I've talked to you about many policy decisions tonight. I have as many policy plans and positions as any candidate, in fact, more than a few of them. And if you look at Marianne 2020 on my issues section, you'll see more. I have plenty of policies and plenty of plans. All I'm saying is that we need an integrative politics. And what I was talking about there specifically, and I wasn't really criticizing the candidates themselves. I was saying if you guys think that this talk about plans is going to be enough to defeat Donald Trump, that was the context. Because I believe that Donald Trump is, as I said earlier, he's ushered in an era of political theater. There are more emotional and psychological dimensions to what he's doing, unfortunately. It's not just an intellectual conversation. As a matter of fact, when you look at the work of such things as Cambridge Analytica, and they're back, they're just under a different name. They will be just as much a part of his campaign this next time as they were last time. Cambridge Analytica was a military-grade propaganda weapon. It was developed in warfare. And what it does is that it implies data mining. Some of that data mining is shadow data mining, very, very shadowy. And its capacity to propagandize and to trigger and to manipulate is almost beyond imagining. That's what we're dealing with here. That's what's going to be coming at us. For those of you who are Democrats, or for those of you who are Republicans or independents but do not wish to see this president reelected, that's what we're going to be dealing with here. And my point is that traditional political strategies, just talking about we're going to do this plan or this policy, will not be enough. That type of manipulation that I'm talking about dismantles reason. It is fear-based. It creates a fear-based reaction that puts people in a mode that dismantles reason, because it puts people in a survival mode. The only power that overrides fear is love. We need a politics of conscience. We need a politics that calls people to sow love of the children, love of the earth, love of each other, love of peace. That is what will create the energy that will override the assault on democracy that his agenda represents.
One of the biggest debates so far among the Democratic primary candidates has been whether they should go in terms of a more Sanders-style single-payer system directly, or a public option that doesn't immediately eliminate private insurance. Based on some of your previous statements and some of the policies on your website, you've indicated that you support the public option that doesn't immediately eliminate private insurance. Why is that?
Well, I will be revealing my healthcare plan in another week or so. It's called the Whole Health Plan. I don't want to see health insurance remain just another capitalist enterprise. I do want to get to the point. I do want private health insurance to be non-profit. But at the same time, I want people to have it if they want it. I can't go all the way over into Bernie's plan. To me, it's like something out of the 1960s. There's a rigidity there. And I understand it's very well-intentioned, but I believe we need to be far more open and expansive today about our entire attitude towards health and the cultivation of health. Right now, everything that we're talking about here with, okay, it's Elizabeth and Bernie over here, and it's Amy and Pete over here. If I had to choose between, if Elizabeth and Bernie are here and Amy and Pete are over there, I'm definitely closer to Elizabeth and Bernie. I'm closer to Elizabeth Bernie and the absolute insistence on no copay, well, the Bernies anyway, no copays, no deductibles, and everybody. At the same time, however, I want a far more integrative approach to health itself. I want far more covered in terms of prevention. I want a plan that covers how many certain lifestyle decisions can not only prevent disease, but even reverse disease. So I want to be not only a president who helps provide health care, but helps provide greater opportunities for health.
Going off of that, how are you going to regulate greater preventions for health without overstepping the private lives of human beings? Because if you're going to regulate everything that goes prior to healthcare, that includes like a healthy diet and includes our water supply, as you said earlier today. So I'm curious if you could expand upon that.
Well, your water supply is a perfect example. We have That's hardly that's hardly interfering with your private life to suggest that maybe you should have safe drinking water. We regulate now 70,000 chemicals in the water, but there are 130,000 chemicals that are in commercial use. If I say I want you to have a park, that doesn't mean I'm telling you have to go to the park. When I say a regulation, for instance, where certain things, if we have a Medicare system, that in my plan the Medicare system would include far more coverage, for instance, for healthy lifestyle things such as going to the gym, a gym membership. That should actually be the kind of thing that is supported. You know, many Americans do, but many Americans do not realize how obscene our medical system is in terms of what a big business it is. It's not only obscene that somebody with cancer has to have a GoFundMe page in order to pay for their chemo. That's bad enough, and I think all Democrats are aware that that's got to end. On the other hand, it's also obscene that any medical procedure in America, as some are, costs up to $1 million. So we have to deal with the fact that so much of the medical industry is something that is too based on a profit-making model to begin with.
You've talked a lot about combating hate and healing divides in this country in a broad sense. How would you go about doing that specifically as president?
What was the very beginning of your sentence? I've talked about
combating hate
divide.
and
Okay.
healing the divides.
You know, when these politicians talk about how divided we are, I laugh to myself, because a lot of the politicians who are talking about how divided we are were the dividers. I don't even think, you know, you're walking down the street, you're on a bus, you're on a train, you're on a plane, you're in a restaurant. You don't ask people who's Republican and who's Democrat. You know, you get on social media, you see all that stuff. You get into the political conversation and you see all that stuff. But I don't think we actually live in that place inside our hearts. You know, President Eisenhower said that the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. And I think that's true. You know, there are high-minded liberal traditions and there are high-minded conservative traditions. The problem is neither conservative nor liberal. The problem is this authoritarian corporatism over here. I want to talk to people as Americans. I'm not talking to you as gay, straight, fluid, rich, poor, black, white, brown. I'm talking to the conscience. I think all of us need to remember you're Jewish and American, you're gay and American, you're black and American. And I believe we need to have a conversation right now on the level where we're not separate. And I don't think any socioeconomic group, or any political group for that matter, has a monopoly on values or a monopoly on care or conscience. And that's the level on which I'm speaking to people. And I think people hear you on the level that you speak.
But when so many people in this country seem unwilling or seem like they're not at a point where they're capable of having that conversation with somebody who they so deeply disagree with, how would you as president facilitate those conversations and make sure that healing actually happens?
You know, I think that one of the things that we realize about the current president is that his consciousness has affected the ethers. And I think President Obama, regardless whether you agreed with him on everything or not, I felt that both he and his wife held a consciousness of great honor and great respect for all Americans. And I think that had a similarly ameliorative effect on the country. The president does not have a magic wand. Right now, thank God, the president does not have a magic wand. And I would not have a magic wand. But I can tell you this. Every American would know, whether they voted for me or not, that I saw my role from the moment I woke up in the morning to the moment I went to bed at night to try to make their lives better. And I believe that Americans are exhausted of the fight. I think that the emotional tenor 2 years ago was anger. I think the emotional tenor right now is exhaustion. And I think that someone who is not, that's why this is one of the reasons why I believe that I'm the best candidate. I heard one of the candidates the other night saying, on TV commercial, saying that he was going to prove that the president is a fraud and a liar. And I thought to myself, to who? Who doesn't know? So the people who love the president are going to vote for the president, but that alone will not get him reelected. The people who are appalled by his agenda, no matter what, are going to vote for the Democrat. But those two groups are too uncomfortably close in number. What we need to do is inspire the people who didn't vote. And part of that is by laying it down in a way that people know that it's not the same old, same old. We need to inspire people who voted third party last time because they didn't feel that the Democratic Party itself was showing up for people the way that they need to. And I also believe that there are millions of Americans. I do believe this. Not everybody would agree with me. But I think there are millions of Americans who voted for him but are disturbed. And if all we do is go on and on about how bad he is, they will feel scolded. They will feel made wrong. They will feel shamed. And that will not make them want to vote for us. I don't want to talk about him. I want to make him irrelevant.
And I believe we've got time for just one more question. You spoke at length tonight about your reparations plan, which, according to your policy proposal on your website, involves distributing these reparations through a council made up of people who aren't politicians, who are activists and academics and people like that. Who chooses this council, and how would they be held accountable to make sure that the money that they're distributing is doing the most good?
I think one of the most important aspects of that plan is the selection of that council. You hone in on something very significant and correct, because that council has to be someone trusted and respected by both white America and black America. I think the hardest part of this reparations plan will be what must be the very, very careful selection. Now, there are some people. There's a gentleman named Sandy Darity, who is a professor at Duke University. He is a scholar on this subject and has been for years. Ta-Nehisi Coates is the kind of person. He's a figure that is known in both black and white America. There are political leaders, but I think it would be quite a appointing those people and getting that right would be a large part of the process. I think that the main selection should come from in negotiation with black leaders and black groups, but at the same time there has to be a buy-in from white America as well, because that's a lot of money. And the whole point of this is reconciliation. But I feel very confident that when you look at the wide array of black leadership in culture, in the arts, in religion, in spirituality, in academia, in scholarly work on this, and in politics, I feel very confident that black America will, out of black America will emerge profound and responsible leadership, which will show honor to their ancestors and great devotion to their descendants. It will be a beautiful thing to see, actually.
So to clarify, would this be a process that's controlled by you as the president, by Congress, by, both in collaboration?
Obviously, there would have to be obviously, this would be passed through Congress. The issue of the election of someone like myself is that I'm very open and out and laying it out there. This is what I want. You know, there's no pussyfooting around. So that means if I'm elected, then the understanding will clearly be that, okay, we're going to do this. Well, let's get started. Now, obviously, this too has a lot to do with, well, who's going to be your Congress, who's going to be your Senate. Even if I'm elected president and we have, let's say, God forbid, a Republican House and a Republican Senate, this is not going to be easy. There are co-equal branches of government. You know, like I said, I wouldn't have a magic wand. But then on the other hand, if the consciousness of this country is such that I'm elected president, then I don't know why we shouldn't be able to envision a Senate without Mitch McConnell at the head.
All right, well, thank you very much. I think now we're going to move into taking a